My favorite comic of all time has to be... Hey y'all, it's Yoo-Hoo. Today I'm gonna do a little bit of a different type of video. This isn't gonna be a video essay. This is actually a Q&A. A few days ago, I put out a post on YouTube and on TikTok, and I told you guys to ask me some questions, and I will answer them in a YouTube Q&A video. So let's get into it. Starting out with the YouTube questions, I got a question from Meatball27 who asked, who are your top 3 writers and artists, and why do they resonate with you? This is gonna be in no particular order. The first name that comes to mind is gonna be Jonathan Hickman. Jonathan Hickman is one of my favorite comic book authors because I absolutely love the way he plays around with storytelling, information, and science fiction oriented worlds. The scope and nature of Hickman's storytelling is unlike a lot of things I've seen in comic books. And the reason for that is because Hickman kind of drip feeds you information as the story goes along. When you first start reading a Jonathan Hickman book, you're probably going to be pretty confused. I know I definitely am. And for some people, that can be frustrating. But the way he drip feeds you information over time makes it so that his storytelling pays off in a really, really big way. That way, when you finally get to the end of the story, you're rewarded with a spectacular payoff that is unlike a lot of things I've read in comic books. Because, most of the time you just get superheroes fighting other, villains with this big action set piece. And yeah, sure, Jonathan Hickman does that, but he does that in a way where the lore and the crazy scope of his world collides with the narrative through lines to create this super spectacular moment. House of X, Powers of X is a great example of this. Secret Wars is a great example of this, and his Fantastic Four and Avengers work is also a great example of this. Long story short, the reason Jonathan Hickman resonates with me is because he's an author that truly understands how to get you to appreciate the scope and brevity of his backdrop. And me personally, I love a world that feels lived in and real. I think it adds to the stakes of the story in a really fun and unique way. The next writer I have on my list is Brian Michael Bendis. Granted, a lot of people have said that Brian Michael Bendis' later work isn't too great. I haven't read any of the recent Brian Michael Bendis output, but when I talk about Brian Michael Bendis, I'm talking about his output from the early 2000s in Marvel. I'm talking about Ultimate Spider-Man. I'm talking about Daredevil. I'm talking about Alias. I'm talking about New Avengers. And the reason I think Brian Michael Bendis is such a good writer, and the reason he resonates with me, is because Brian Michael Bendis understands how to craft dialogue in a way that feels effortless. Whenever you read a Brian Michael Bendis dialogue page, sometimes it could be filled to the brim with words, just non-stop dialogue bubbles. And when you just look at the page and see all of those words, it can feel truly overwhelming. But the way Bendis writes is so conversational. It feels very authentic to his characters. Bendis writes Peter Parker like a high schooler. He talks like a high schooler. So when you read the dialogue, it's not this verbose, expositional dialogue storytelling that we're used to from, Stan Lee's Spider-Man. Instead, it just feels like this very synergistic flow of writing, and it's so entertaining to read. That's what makes his writing super engaging and special to me, alongside the fact that he's just put out phenomenal bodies of work. Finally, this is going to be no surprise to y'all. My favorite comic author of all time has got to be Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison is downright insane. I'm not even going to lie. Their writing can be very confusing, and sometimes it feels like the dribble of a madman. But I think that's what makes it so good. I love how Morrison is always unapologetically themselves. Whether it's for better or for worse, when you read a Morrison book, you're going to read something that feels authentic to who Grant Morrison is. You're going to feel confused. You're going to feel frustrated. Sometimes you're going to feel like it's downright unintelligible. And I know on the surface that sounds insane, and you're like, why the hell would you want to read an author who writes unintelligible works? Well, let me tell you. You can tell Morrison wears their heart on their sleeve with every single story they write. They care about the characters they're writing. They care about the scope, the brevity, and the continuity of the pre-established world, and they want to respect that and add their own flair to it. On top of that, Morrison is a person of principle. They believe in things, and they're not afraid to show their beliefs in their works. Animal Man is a great example of this. It's a book about a superhero who becomes an animal rights activist because Morrison, at one point in their life, was an animal rights activist and a vegetarian. And to me personally, seeing an author express themselves is what can elevate a story from a good story to a great story. As far as my favorite artists, I'm not sure. I'm gonna have to come back to that another time. I love a lot of different artists, and quite frankly, there's just too many for me to name right now. Moving on to the next question. This is from Biscuit Boy 8734, who said, have you read any of the Energon universe? If so, please review them sometime. Keep up the comic fun. So, unfortunately, I actually haven't read any of the Energon universe. I'm kind of just waiting for the Energon universe to get released in the oversized collected hardcover format, just because that's the way I prefer to read books. I know in May, Transformers is getting a deluxe oversized hardcover, so as soon as that book comes out, I'm going to read it, I'm going to review it, and I'm going to talk about it. I love Daniel Warren Johnson. I love Transformers. I'm super stoked for that. But yeah, haven't read any of the Energon universe, but I will soon, I promise. Next question comes from FXRISSS, who asked, what's the most heart-wrenching story you've ever read in a comic? This is a really hard question, and there's a lot of books that come to my mind when I hear this question. I'm thinking about We Three by Grant Morrison. I'm thinking about Mr. Miracle by Tom King. I'm thinking about Murder Falcon or Do a Powerbomb by Daniel Warren Johnson. These were all books that, quite frankly, have destroyed me emotionally. But ultimately, the answer I'm going to go with is Animal Man by Grant Morrison. Animal Man by Grant Morrison is not only one of the most emotional books I've ever read, but it's one of the most emotional pieces of media I've ever consumed. The reason Animal Man by Grant Morrison is so impactful to me personally is because in that book, Morrison plays around with real world grief and loss and contextualizes it to the fictional story of Animal Man in a way that's unlike anything I've ever seen. It made me view the medium of comics differently. It made me look at life differently, and I'm not gonna lie, the ending made me cry. It's so good. Highly recommend you check it out. Next up, we have a question from the Smile Guy 9799, who asks, what D-list hero do you want to see make a comeback? This is a hard question just because I don't read a lot of D-list heroes. Like, I'm a big Batman guy. I read a lot of Batman. I read a lot of Daredevil. The heroes I read are kind of popular heroes. I had to think on this quite a bit, but one answer I came up with is Phantom X. Phantom X is a character who is introduced in Grant Morrison's new X-Men. I think Phantom X is like a mutant who was kind of grown in a lab to be a weapon, kind of similar to Wolverine, but they escaped and now they're this like thief mercenary type character. Their role in New X-Men is really interesting. I thought their presence in Uncanny X-Force by Rick Remender was really good, and I also really like the way Jonathan Hickman used Phantom X in his X-Men run. Phantom X is just a really interesting character. He has a lot of cool technology. He has a really distinct background. He has access to some really cool worlds he can play around in. And I just think there's a lot of potential to have a lot of fun with his character and make a really unique and thought-provoking run if the right artist and the right author decided to write that book. Next up, I have a question from Aaron Runners, who asks, have you read Spider-Man from JMS? Yes, I have read Spider-Man from JMS. I actually have it on my shelf right here. Fantastic Spider-Man run. I love the way Peter is a teacher in that run. I love his relationship with MJ. There's a lot of great villains and great action. Specifically, Morlun is a super crazy and prominent threat that I thought was so fun to read. The artwork by John Romita Jr. and Mike Deodato is fantastic, and I know a lot of people hate the ending of that. A lot of people don't like One More Day. Honestly, I didn't hate One More Day. I think the ending actually makes a lot of sense in context to what was going on in the run, and the ending had me feeling a little bittersweet. It was a captivating arc, and I think it ended appropriately. That being said, Sins Past is a story that's also collected in that run, and I hate Sins Past. I think it's horrible. But overall, JMS's Spider-Man is fantastic. I absolutely love it. Highly recommend it. Moving on to some TikTok questions. The first question is from Just Someone Who Likes Lego, who asks, how do you feel about the treatment of artists and writers in the comic book industry? To be honest, I haven't really looked too much into the way comic authors and artists are treated, but I know in a lot of cases it's not really fair. First of all, I think fans are kind of crazy and abusive. There's so many stories of fans writing in death threats to comic book authors just because fans don't like the way the authors are writing fictional characters. I think that's absolutely bizarre, and it's just a crazy thing that authors have to deal with that. On top of that, I think authors and artists just deserve more pay in general. John Romita Jr. is super old. I think he's in his 60s and he's still drawing. John Romita Jr. is an industry legend. He should have a lot of money, but I think the reason he's drawing right now is probably because he's just been underpaid and still needs money to fund his life, which is insane. He's past the age of retirement and he's still doing comic book art that people don't like and hate on all the time. I don't think it's fair. I think he would never even be in this position in the first place if he was just fairly compensated for his work. And then you just have like the lack of residuals that comic book authors and artists get for characters. I know a lot of comic comic book movies like the MCU take a lot of inspiration from comics, and a lot of times authors and artists don't get paid residuals for creating those storylines in the comic books first, mainly because those characters already existed. I may be wrong here, but I only think authors and artists get residuals if they create the character. So you can write a phenomenal story on Daredevil that the TV show is inspired by, but you won't get any residuals from the TV show even if they take a lot of your main plot beats, because Daredevil is a character you didn't create, and I don't think that's fair either. Moving on to the next question from So I Got This, who asks, favorite comic book movie or top 5 movies in general? I'm gonna give a really basic answer here, but it's my answer. Of course, you gotta go with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2. I grew up on that film. I love Tobey Maguire. I think that's a damn near perfect superhero movie. What can I say about that movie that hasn't been said? It's awesome. Next up, I'm gonna go Dark Knight, another really prominent and impactful movie from my childhood. That movie made me fall in love with the character of Batman in a way that cartoons didn't really do at the time, and then after that, I became totally obsessed with Batman. Dark Knight, fantastic movie. And then finally, the Batman 2022. I really love the Batman 2022. I think Robert Pattinson is a great Batman. I love how he's more emo and recluse. It really makes sense. And I think it does a really interesting job at contextualizing mental health and social isolation and how that plays into the vigilante character of Batman. I think that's a really cool theme that not a lot of stories tend to explore, and I loved it. That movie also reignited my spark and passion for comics, and after that movie came out, I started collecting again. So huge shout out to the Batman. Next up, we have a question from Starfish Gem, who said, what do you think is an omnibus that isn't good but you read because someone recommended it to you? There's a lot of books that come to mind for this one, but the one I'm gonna go with is gonna be the Infinite Crisis omnibus. People absolutely adore Infinite Crisis. They call it one of the best DC Crisis events of all time, and when I was new into the hobby, I bought that book because I heard only positive praise. Then I read the book and I was like, damn, I don't really like it. I think it starts out super strong, but once it gets to the main Crisis event, there's just so many characters. It's pulling from old lore like Crisis on Infinite Earths. It just felt very overwhelming, and I couldn't really resonate with a lot of the characters because there was just too much action on every page. I think it's fun. I think the art's beautiful. The action is crazy, but it's just nothing unique or special in my opinion. Hot take. I'm just not a big fan of Infinite Crisis. Moving on to the next question from Yancey, who asks, favorite artists. This is another really hard one to pick. I think all the heavy hitters come into my mind first. I'm thinking Jim Lee. I'm thinking Alex Ross. I'm thinking Dan Mora. I'm thinking Bruno Redondo. I'm thinking Todd McFarlane. Phenomenal artists. I love all of their works. But the one that like my gut says to go with is going to be Frank Quitely. I think Frank Quitely uses the medium of comics and just the layout of a comic book page and the paneling of comic books to play with action and movement and kineticism in a way that not a lot of artists are able to capture. I think Frank Quitely has some of the most spectacular action set pieces I've ever seen in comics. Particularly Frank Quitely's work on Batman and We Three really stand out to me. I love those works. Huge shout out to Frank Quitely. He's the GOAT. This is from Chromium Collector, who asks, a lot of your collection is primarily omnibuses. Is there a reason you choose them over trades? Personally, I like reading on the go, so while I have a few I like, trades more. Okay, hear me out. Omnis are the way to go in my personal opinion and for my personal lifestyle. I don't really leave the house much, and when I do leave the house, I don't plan on reading. I think omnis look beautiful on the shelf, and I think while there's a big upfront cost for omnibus editions, I think in the long term, if you kind of boy math it out, it makes sense. If you think about it, there's probably like 5 to 6 trades collected in one omni, sometimes more, sometimes less. Let's say one omni costs $125. If you have 6 trades collected in an omni, that's going to be $120, right? A trade's usually like $20. And so because of that, I think it comes out to the same price in the long term. You're just paying a heftier fee up front. Plus, a lot of the times you can get omnis for really good discounts too. Like I get them usually at like 25 to 40% off. So I'm never really paying full cover price for an omnibus edition. I also just like the fact that omnis are kind of one and done. You can just read the entirety of an omni and just be done with it. Whereas trades, you have to keep buying more and more trades. I like to binge a story all the way through. I don't want to have to like read one book, put it back on the shelf, pull another book off the shelf, put it back on the shelf. I think omnis are just better for that in that regard. Moving on to the next question from Cole Comics, who asks, who/what's the most overrated comic comic artist and or writer. The most overrated comic author, in my opinion, is Mark Millar. When I was a kid, I loved the Civil War comic. It was so cool, so fire, so much fun. But when I reread it as an adult, I was just like, yeah, I don't know if this holds up as much. It just feels very edgy, and I think a lot of Mark Millar's writing is super edgy. The Ultimates is really edgy, Old Man Logan is really edgy, Civil War is really edgy. Just the way Mark Millar writes, it seems to focus on this like crazy theatrical, almost movie-like storytelling, which is really fun, but I'm just not a big fan of the tone Mark Millar uses. And honestly, a lot of his works that people love, I'm just not a big fan of. Next up is a question from Elliot, who asks, what are your favorite comics based solely on visual artwork? When I think about impactful artwork, I'm thinking about artwork that looks unique. I think when a story has artwork that is unlike anything else I've ever seen, that's when it really stands out to me. And so that's why the answer to this question has got to be Arkham Asylum. It's haunting, it's visceral, it's scary, it's psychedelic, and it really captures the energy of the story in a way that is so cool and so impactful. Granted, there are other stories that have phenomenal art too. This answer may change over time, but that's just the first name that comes to mind. Next up is a question from EXO, who asked, what was your first comic book? The first comic I remember reading was Batman Knightfall. My dad had this really thick trade of the entire first half of the Knightfall event. It was so old that the pages were yellow, and I read it over and over and over and over again to the point where the pages started separating from the binding and the book started falling apart. But I loved Batman Knightfall. It's so much fun. It's such a fun story because you get to see Batman fight all of these different rogues, and then it ends with that climax of Bane breaking Batman's spine into two separate pieces, which is such a crazy moment even till this day. Even if you read it today, you have this buildup of Batman fighting all of these villains and getting more tired over time. So when he finally does confront Bane, you see he's tired. He doesn't have the energy in him. He's not at 100%. And so that fight just feels so raw and vulnerable, and it's such a crazy moment. I love it. Next up, we have a question from Bogo, who asks, favorite album? Listen, I'm an avid music listener. Here are some of my recent Last.fm stats if anyone's interested. It's really hard to just pick one album that I love. Obviously, there are all the classics. You got To Pimp a Butterfly, OK Computer, Ram by Daft Punk, Donuts by Dilla, All Hell West Texas by Mountain Goats, some rap songs by Earl are just a couple of albums that pop into my mind as all-time classics. But one album that I've had on heavy rotation recently is Ants from Up There by Black Country New Road. So good. Definitely check that album out if you haven't. Alright, and the last comic we're going to answer in this video is from President54, who asks, what's your favorite comic? My favorite comic of all time has to be Animal Man by Grant Morrison. I've talked about it already in this video, but there's a reason Animal Man by Grant Morrison is one of the best. It's because Animal Man is a story that plays around with the medium of comics in a way that no other book really does. When I first read Animal Man, it changed the way I look at comics. It changed the way I looked at any media in general, and it made me feel super emotional. It made me cry. It made me think about life, loss, the meaning of it all. And it's so impactful because Morrison isn't afraid to wear their heart on their sleeve. They talk about things that are important to them. They do things that not a lot of authors would have done because they would have been scared about alienating the audience. But Morrison didn't care about that. They wanted to tell the story they wanted to tell, and because of that, it just changed my life, and it changed the way I look at comics. And I honestly owe my love for the medium of comics to Animal Man by Grant Morrison. But yeah, that's the Q&A. Hope you guys have enjoyed. This is the first time I've been on camera, so it might be a little choppy. I might try to do more stuff like this where I hop on camera and just yap a little bit if you guys like it. And I also have a lot of other questions that I was unable to answer, so if you guys want me to keep doing Q&As, maybe I can do them every once in a while. Let me know down below. But as always, hope you guys have enjoyed. Thanks for watching.